Well, welcome everyone to Coffee with Chaplain Tom for Wednesday, October the 7th. I have had a lot of time, as you have during this COVID crisis, to think about a lot of things. And one of the things that I have been thinking about are the life lessons that I've learned from others, basically reflecting on not just the people who have made a difference in my life, but what it is that I think I gained from them. Now, I think that most of us can identify some certain key people in our lives that made a difference. A family member, a neighbor, a leader in our community, and perhaps even someone we did not know well who said or did something that made a difference. One of my favorite poems is by Robert Fulghum, and it's entitled, "All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten." It reminds us that some of life's basic lessons are often simple, even if it may take us a while to sink in and make them part of our own. Let me give you a couple of examples from his poem. Share everything, play fair, don't hit people. Put things back where you found them. Clean up your own mess. Sounds like something my mother would have said. And then these two. Wash your hands before you eat. Flush. Warm cookies and cold milk are good for you. Well, those are just a little segments from his poem that actually he turned into a book and elaborate on all of them. Well, I'm indebted to many people for some simple things that I have learned and for some things that have become lifelong lessons that have helped make me who I am today. And as I continue on this journey of life, will be indebted to you and others who will continue to hopefully teach me some things. So I have a pretty long list of people to whom I'm grateful. And I've tried to narrow it down, and I've left off people I'm sure that I could speak about some for a long time. But I want to acknowledge that even though I have condensed this list, that as I serve you as your chaplain, I also learn from you. Sometimes I'm aware of what I'm learning as it happens, and other times I only discover it in hindsight when I look back. And perhaps that is how it is for us today. So I've grouped it into three areas that are of people and the lessons that I've learned. The first area has to do with the formation, the forming and the creation of my faith, my personal faith. Well, I have to go back to childhood and remember two people who by their example were, I think, key to my faith, probably because I remember them, and so they must be significant. The first was the first minister that I knew, a Reverend Dingley. I've forgotten his first name. He and his wife were British. They were serving a United Methodist Church in Palmetto, Florida, and they were pretty formal, not just in their speech, but also in their actions. And so in spite of that, though, I do remember as a young person that until I was probably about 10 or 11, Reverend Dr. Dingley, I just remembered he was Dr. Dingley, somehow had a warmth in spite of that formality that made our church a welcoming place for children. And I just remember that by example. The other person was Ralph Campbell Sr. I also know his son Ralph Campbell Jr. But Ralph Campbell Sr., when I was a child, was an older gentleman, and he had for a number of years been the, quote, lay leader of the congregation who worked along with the pastor who was the minister. I don't remember specific things that I learned from him, but I know he was an example to me because later on in my young adulthood, I had the same position he did. And I know I learned a lot by just watching Mr. Ralph Campbell Sr. I also believe the very first funeral that I remember attending as a child was Mr. Ralph Campbell Sr.'s funeral. I was probably about 10 or 11 years old. So those two were by example. And then by relationship, I have family members who helped to create and nurture and form my faith. My parents, of course, deserve a lot of credit. But I will say that my Aunt Mona, my father's sister, made sure that my brother Dan and I, when we were little, came to church and went to the Sunday school class, even if mom and dad happened to be taking a vacation from church. Aunt Mona also taught one of the classes, so she was going to be there, and she made sure that we were there just about every Sunday. And every once in a while, she would take my brother and I, and we would have a little picnic lunch on the Manatee River, and we'd go fishing. And she taught me some pretty basic stuff about fishing before I got to do that with my father and others. So Aunt Mona was one by our relationship, made sure that we were going to be part of the church's education program for children. And then by relationship with my grandmother, my Nana, Eloise Myers. Nana happened to live right across the street from the church. And as I learned later, she had seen ministers and changes in the church come and go over the years. She had a quiet faith that was never something that she spoke in a way to try to convince you or do things, but she just lived that faith in ways that I think have, especially as I look back, had a great impact on my life. She supported the Reverend Billy Graham, and so she got magazines and books and things pretty regularly. And that was part of her regular reading. She was a big reader. She also liked Louis L'Amour Western novels and other things too. But she read, I think, probably everything that Billy Graham sent out during that time and period, his organization. And as my parents were probably smart enough to send me to Nana's house once in a while so that she would be a babysitter, or they would have time to do whatever they needed to do. When I was at Nana's house, she often just worked in her kitchen, cooking something from scratch, talking about her faith or something she had read, maybe a story. And I learned a lot of, just by being with her, a lot about just who she was. I never remember her lecturing or giving something that she was trying to teach. She just talked about her faith and her life, and by osmosis, by relationship, I know I learned a lot from her. Well, the second area is people who I learned personal and maybe some lifelong lessons. I have two teachers and several friends on this. Inez Pettigrew was my 5th grade teacher. I learned later that what she did for me, she did for almost every student she could get her hands on. And she followed her students often into high school and was often seen at the graduation at Palmetto High School to help celebrate that. She was not at mine, I don't believe, because she was suffering from cancer and eventually died. But she, when I was in her class, always made sure she offered opportunities to each student. She recruited me and others to give a daily weather report in the class. She would find whatever was interesting to a particular person, little boy or girl, and she would encourage them to do something with that. She encouraged her students to be part of 4-H, and many of my neighbors and fellow friends we lived on an orange grove, but many of them had a farm with some cattle or the opportunity to raise animals. And so 4-H was also an opportunity for them to raise crops and animals and exhibit them at the fair, and sometimes have people bid and pay for those animals. But what she encouraged me to do was to find something to do. And so I ended up signing up for a public speaking contest where we competed at the county fair. I had never done anything like that before. I, to this day, don't know why or how that happened, but somehow or other, that's where I ended up. And so my first public speech before probably about 100 or so people was at the county fair. And my topic was UFOs. And it was a typical 10 or 11-year-old boy kind of interest at the time. So Mrs. Pettigrew encouraged and provided opportunities. Next after that was Bob Dittman, who was my high school chorus teacher. Many of you have heard of the Big Brother, Big Sister program where men or women kind of help mentor boys and girls who could use someone in their life. Mr. Dittman did that for students by the dozens at our high school, especially reaching out to young men. I think it was remarkable that as I look back that about half of the football team was in the chorus also at school. And that took some recruiting to build that up, but somehow Mr. Dittman did that. He encouraged me to be in chorus. He is the one who suggested that I try out for the school play, which was a musical. He played piano and led a tiny little ensemble of instrumentalists at our local community theater for the musical theater. And he always recruited students to come and help turn pages and usher and do things. And it was one of the ways he exposed many of us, including me, to our first example of live theater. I've continued that love my whole life. Bob Dittman played organ for local churches. He, his faith was just something that was part of what he did. And he occasionally would invite students to go to church. He actually played organ at our church for a while. And I will say that I must credit him for helping set me up and provide the opportunity for my first college scholarship, where I was able to go to community college. So those are two teachers. The other person I'm going to mention is someone who is a lifelong friend. He even now lives here in Orlando, just a couple miles away. His name is Hardy Sandlin. I met him on my first visit to Atlanta to check out the seminary at Emory University. And after meeting him and following up with him the next year when I became a student myself, he and I have been a colleague and friend for over 40 years. Hardy is an example of what friendship is really like, and I treasure that well. I also have life lessons I've learned sort of by working with two couples who are members of our church. The first is Mel and Mary Jacob. He ran the counseling center before he retired. Mary is a social worker counselor. I got to know them well as when Mel and I were spiritual directors, the clergy spiritual directors for some retreats a number of years ago. And they have just become friends, and we have seen each other through a lot of life changes. The same would be Jim and Diane DeMark, who live over in Baldwin Park. And we also have become part of small groups and things. And I must say, I thank them for allowing me to join in the last few years on their season tickets for the Orlando Magic, because they've had tickets from the very beginning and allowed me to join in on that. Well, the third category is what I'm just kind of calling professional development. People who have helped me as I have grown as a local church pastor and a chaplain, and as a person that encourages people to grow in their spiritual life. The first was my pastor, Larry Cook, who, even though I was only 17, 18, 19, and 20 in the years that he was at our church, he sort of took me under his wing. He encouraged me to be part of decision making and say, Tom, I could use some help on Sunday. Will you come and lead and do some things? He became a friend, and I think we grew a lot when he and I were the two adults. I was barely an adult at 18 or 19, who drove a busload of kids to North Carolina for a week-long summer program on a church bus that was a standard transmission, and going up and down the mountains, you had to double clutch that thing. So anyway, he and I became close doing that. There are two of my professors at Emory University who I credit with what they taught me. I have learned and used a good part of my life. The first was Fred Craddock, who wrote a book called Overhearing the Gospel. And his style of preaching was not directive, it was more indirective. It was more storytelling and the use of stories so that people would hear the message. And I was fortunate to have him as a teacher for a preaching class. And then when I was serving a congregation myself, I received a fellowship that allowed me and about a dozen other young ministers to do 2 weekend studies that year with Professor Craddock. The second was Jim Fowler, who I had only one class with, but his book and his material meant a lot to me on faith development. The idea that people often, as we develop in our own lives, in other ways, educational, personal, that it helped me to see a way that people are in different places in the way that they look at faith. Not that one is better or more important or more right than the other, but that those are important ways that each of us see our own faith. The next one is Carl Anderson. He was my supervisor at Sarasota Hospital for clinical pastoral education. Carl was a kind man who could just listen when you talked about your clinical interaction with someone in the hospital. And then he would just ask a pointed question. Well, but didn't you hear them say that? And suddenly you realize, oh, I missed something important. He knew how to get your attention without beating you over the head with it. And Carl Anderson told me, Tom, trust your intuition. That is just as valuable as the information and knowledge you have. Trust your intuition. Well, guess what? I have only 4 more who are professional development, and then we'll get on. Walter Rutland was the first minister I worked with. He and I were in Sarasota working together. He was in the twilight of his career, and I was just beginning. He treated me as a co-pastor with him. He gave respect, responsibility, expectations, and we worked together on everything. Walter was a wise man, and I have learned things from him just by example as much as anything else, including the heart that he had to care for people, and that was key to everything. I also remember John Huggett, who is still a friend of mine today. He lives in South Carolina part of the year and down at Solavita part of the year. He was the chaplain supervisor at Hospice of Central Florida, who hired me and gave me a chance to prove myself and helped provide me with a lot of guidance. We met every week for a while to help me get up to speed on being a hospice chaplain. So my 25 years of chaplaincy, I owe to John helping me get started. And then one person whom I met briefly only by shaking his hand, a man named Thomas Moore. He wrote a book called about nurturing your soul. And I heard him speak in Daytona Beach probably about 20 years ago. But he talks about the spiritual life as nurturing your soul and some of the deep things that are creative and all that are part of that. And that has stayed its course and meaning a lot to me. And then I've got to mention Gail Watley here at Village on the Green, because she and Ansley Holt are the two that hired me here 7 years ago this week. They gave me a chance here. I've loved every minute of it. And I will say that with Gail, she and I have talked about our faith. We have talked about the challenges of being of different races and of how we look at things. And I have learned a lot from Gail, and I must give her that credit. So thank you for indulging me in sharing some of the things I've learned and some of the people who have contributed to my life. So I'd like to consider you ask yourself two questions. One, think about who has touched your life in ways that make a difference. If you have a chance to reflect back, and if they're still around, you can thank them, or you can just look about and be grateful for those who have touched your life. And then the second question is, who have I touched? We might be grateful that we had opportunities to touch other lives, and how might we be an influence today in the lives of others? Whether it's a friend or a neighbor, a member of our family, a grandchild, great-grandchild, someone in our extended family, that we have an opportunity to connect by phone or internet, or maybe soon by person, to see that no matter where we are in our stages of life, that we have the opportunity to have an influence in ways that may seem subtle, that may seem insignificant, but may make a difference in the long term. Well, I gave you a hint at Robert Fulghum's poem, and I'm going to read the rest of it to you. All I really need to know, I learned in kindergarten. Quote, most of what I really need to know about how to live and what to do and how to be, I learned in kindergarten. Wisdom was not at the top of the graduate school mountain, but there in the sand pile at Sunday school. These are the things I learned. Share everything. Play fair. Don't hit people. Put things back where you found them. Clean up your own mess. Don't take things that aren't yours. Say you're sorry when you hurt somebody. Wash your hands before you eat. Flush. Warm cookies and cold milk are good for you. Live a balanced life. Learn some and think some and draw and paint and sing and dance and play and work every day some. Take a nap every afternoon. And when you go out into the world, watch out for traffic, hold hands and stick together. Be aware of wonder. We live in a wonderful world. I enjoy every minute of it. Have a great day.